The train whistle howled like a wounded animal, echoing across the vast plains as the iron beast rolled into the station at Silverbrook Junction, a raw-boned logging town with more pine trees than people and a welcome committee made of mud, spit, and suspicion. Clara May Whitlock sat in the third car from the front, gripping her suitcase with both hands, her knuckles white against the worn brown leather. She had crossed half the country by rail, leaving behind the soot-stained alleys of Chicago and her job hemming sleeves for men who never looked her in the eye. She had replied to an advertisement posted in the back of a farming catalog, seeking sturdy woman of good character to wed homesteader in need of strong help and stronger heart. She'd reread those words 100 times, holding them like a promise in the quiet of her tiny room back east. She'd written her letter carefully, included a photograph, and when the reply came a short, polite acceptance from a man named Everett Boone, her heart had all but burst with cautious hope. Clara had never been thin. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with strong hands and hips made for work. In Chicago, that had made her invisible or worse mocked. But in the world Everett described, size was an asset. He spoke of splitting wood, carrying water, raising animal tasks she'd done before, gladly. She believed, maybe foolishly, that he saw something beyond her appearance. Now, as the train hissed to a halt, she pressed her bonnet down over her pinned curls and stood. Her heart drummed a beat of nervous joy. This was it. A new life. A man who wanted her. A place she could belong. She stepped off the train with her trunk in tow and looked around. Everett Boone was easy to spot. A lanky man with a stiff collar standing near the postmaster with arms folded and a half scowl already on his lips. Clara smiled and approached, offering a soft, "Hello, Mr. Boone?" He looked her up and down once, then twice, slower, his lip curled. "You're Clara May?" he asked, like the name had suddenly turned sour in his mouth. She nodded, her smile faltering. "Yes, sir, it's good to meet you at last." A long pause. He looked past her, toward the train car, as though expecting someone else to descend. "You didn't mention," he muttered, "that you were so much." The crowd on the platform quieted, a few children stared, a couple of older women whispered behind gloved hands. Clara's breath hitched. "I included my photograph," she said softly, her voice already shrinking under the weight of the moment. Everett laughed. Short, cruel thing. You must have sent the wrong one." Another man nearby, likely a logger, chuckled into his collar. "She's got more meat than my prize hog," someone snorted. The crowd laughed. Clara didn't. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Everett stepped back, shaking his head like a man cheated at cards. "This won't work," he said plainly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I need a wife who won't eat more than I can chop." He turned his back and walked away. Just like that. The crowd, unsure of whether to comfort or condemn, began to scatter. The train belched steam and groaned as it prepared to depart. Clara stood frozen, suitcase still in hand, cheeks blazing hot. The station master offered a weak, uncomfortable shrug. "You, got folks to stay with?" he asked. Clara shook her head slowly. She had no one here. No one at all. The train whistle blew again. She could have climbed back on, could have gone home, tail between her legs, but something in her spine stiffened. She turned from the tracks and walked past the station, past the saloon, past the gawking townsfolk. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away from there. That night she slept in the loft of an empty barn, curled against her trunk like a shield. She didn't eat, didn't cry, just stared at the rafters and tried to remember the words in Everett's ad. Stronger heart. What a damn lie. In the days that followed, she wandered. Silverbrook was not built for pity. The general store clerk told her flatly that there were no jobs for stray women. The boarding house turned her away. "We don't want trouble," the owner said, eyes flicking to her wide frame like it was a sign of sin. A widow gave her bread. A stable boy gave her directions to an old abandoned trapper's cabin north of town, half swallowed by the forest. "It's got a roof mostly," he said. "And no one's claimed it in years." Clara thanked him with what little dignity she had left and started walking. The journey through the pines was long and cold, and with each step she shed another piece of the hope she'd carried from Chicago. But by the time she reached the clearing and saw the crooked chimney and leaning porch, she no longer wanted rescue. She wanted roots. She wanted silence. She wanted to forget Everett Boone and everyone like him. The cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. The stove was rusted but intact. The bed was a pile of mouse-chewed blankets. It was perfect. She unpacked her bag, and for the first time in days, she breathed. Clara May Whitlock had been rejected like trash, but this cabin didn't care about her size. The wind didn't laugh, the trees didn't sneer, and deep down, something fierce began to rise. Maybe, she thought, if no one in this town could see her worth, she'd build a life they couldn't ignore. The first week in the cabin was survival. Clara May Whitlock didn't come to the woods with a pioneer's know-how, or a backwoodsman's grittenly, a suitcase full of patched clothes, a battered journal, and a heart bruised so deep it throbbed, even when she slept. The trapper's cabin was barely standing, its roof missing shingles, its windows cracked and sagging in their frames. The front door leaned on one hinge, creaking like it mourned its own decay. But it was hers, and that meant everything. Each morning she rose before the sun and worked until her hands were numb. She cleared brush with a rusted hatchet she found buried under the porch. She patched the roof with pine boughs and stripped bark. She nailed old boards across holes with salvaged nails and a flat rock in place of a hammer. Every task became a fight against hopelessness. Every wound a scar she wore proudly. Food was scarce at first. The bread the widow had given her was gone by day 2, and she had no money to barter. But she found wild onions in the woods, berries in the bramble, and dug up roots she remembered from her grandmother's kitchen. Hunger still stalked her, sharp and cruel, but she learned to ration. When it rained, she set out buckets to catch water and used her coat to patch the roof leaks. When it snowed, and it did, even in late fall, she stuffed rags in the cracks and huddled under every blanket she owned. At night, she cried, quietly. Not the desperate sobs of someone broken, but the slow, leaking kind, the tears of grief that roll down without permission, the ones that come for more than just one heartbreak. She missed her mother, dead 5 years now, missed the way her father used to call her, my sturdy girl, his voice full of warmth even when the world mocked her shape. She missed music, laughter, bread warm from the oven, but mostly she missed the version of herself that had believed in love letters and mail-order salvation. That Clara felt so far away now, as if she'd stepped off the train and never arrived, leaving only bones behind. Yet something strange happened in that silence. Clara began to hear herself again. Without the weight of townspeople's stares or Everett Boone's sneers, her thoughts became clearer. She remembered stories her mother used to tell of frontier women who survived alone, who stitched homes from nothing and raised children with bare hands and bullet grit. She wasn't them, not yet, but she could be. Slowly, she carved out a rhythm. Wake with the sun. Fetch wood. Boil water. Forage. Repair. Write. At night, by the fire, she wrote in her journal with fierce purpose, and not just the day's notes, but pieces of herself she refused to let vanish. She wrote letters she'd never send. To Everett, telling him exactly what he'd lost. To her younger self, offering kindness she never received. To her future children, if she ever had them, describing how hard-earned survival tasted better than anyone's pity. By the 3rd week, Clara could split small logs. By the 5th, she had sealed most of the cabin against the wind. Her hands blistered and cracked. Her shoulders ached. But her spirit? It thickened like stew over a fire slow, steady, impossible to rush. When she ventured to the stream for water, she caught her reflection in the pool, cheeks flushed, eyes alert, dirt smudged across her brow like war paint. She laughed, actually laughed, at the wild creature staring back. She was not pretty in the way the world liked, but she was radiant with survival, and no one could take that from her. She began to decorate the cabin not with silk or frills, but with feathers she found near the creek, pine cones arranged in little circles on the mantel, smooth river stones stacked in thoughtful piles. She hung a makeshift curtain from an old shawl, tucked dried flowers between the pages of her journal, little acts of beauty, tiny rebellions against a world that said she didn't deserve either. The loneliness was still there, of course. Some nights it felt like a second skin, but Clara learned to live with it, not fear it. She sang softly while she worked. hummed lullabies to herself when the wind howled like wolves. She talked to the fire as she stirred soup, telling it about her dreams and memories, and in those moments she didn't feel so alone. Then winter came, a sudden brutal blizzard that roared through the valley like God's own reckoning. Clara barely made it through the first storm. Her firewood was low, and the food she'd stored was not enough. Snow piled against the door, locking her in. The cold crept under her blankets, into her bones, threatening to undo everything she'd fought to rebuild. Her fingers turned purple from frost, her breath became shallow. She wrote a goodbye letter in her journal just in case. Not sad, just honest. A record. But she didn't die. She rationed her food tighter, burned the last of her books for warmth. She took the iron pan and banged it against the chimney in case anyone was nearby. She prayed not to be rescued, but to hold on just one more day, and that was the night the knock came. A single heavy knock. Firm. Certain. Not the wind. Clara staggered to the door, her hands trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. When she opened it, she saw him, an enormous figure in the snow, beard thick with ice, shoulders wide enough to block out the moonlight. He looked down at her with eyes the color of tree bark and said simply, "You're freezing to death, miss." And just like that, her story shifted again, not because she was saved, but because someone saw her and didn't flinch. The man who stood in Clara's doorway was a mountain wrapped in flannel and flurries, his breath visible in thick clouds against the night. Snow clung to his beard like it had taken root there. He didn't ask permission to come inside, just ducked his head, shouldered through the narrow frame, and closed the storm behind him like he was sealing a tomb. The fire had nearly gone out, but he knelt by it immediately, feeding it small twigs from a pouch on his hip until the flames hissed and swelled. Clara stood frozen near the bed, her body swaying with cold and suspicion. He looked up, eyes catching the firelight. "Name's Elias," he said, voice gravel, thick but calm. "Elias Thorne. Saw smoke yesterday. Figured someone was still breathing in here." Clara didn't answer at first. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a side of mockery or a price. But something about Elias's eyes, the quiet in them, the way they didn't flick down her body like she was a sideshow, told her she could loosen her fists. Just a little. "Clara," she said hoarsely. "Clara May Whitlock." He nodded once. "You got anything to eat?" She pointed to a tin of boiled roots. Without complaint, he spooned some into a cracked bowl and ate like a man who'd tasted worse. "Storm's not done," he said between bites. "I got an axe and a tarp. I can help reinforce this place, if that's all right." That night, Elias slept sitting upright in a corner, wrapped in a bearskin he'd carried on his back. Clara watched him through half-lidded eyes, unsure whether he was a blessing or just another man with his own ghosts. But when morning came and the storm lifted, she woke to find the cabin transformed. Elias had patched the roof with bark and rope, shored up the door with a log brace. He had even fixed the stovepipe and arranged a snow trench to drain away from the cabin's edge. Clara stepped outside and blinked at the sudden organization of her once chaotic world. He was splitting wood, shirt sleeves rolled up, arms thick as oak branches, swinging the axe with a rhythm like a heartbeat. "You're not from Silverbrook," she said, handing him a tin cup of warm broth later. He took it with a nod. "Lived near the ridge most of my life, don't care for town." Clara chuckled. "That makes two of us." A pause. Then, softly, "They ran me out." Elias didn't press, just sipped his broth and said, "Folk don't know much past their own boots." Over the next week, they fell into an odd rhythm, two strangers bound by ice and silence. Elias didn't pry, Clara didn't explain, but they worked together as if they had been doing it for years. She cooked. He chopped. She mended blankets. He built a new outhouse from scrapwood. When he laughed, which was rare, it was low and warm, like thunder in a distant valley. Clara found herself watching him sometimes, not out of romance, but curiosity. He moved like a man used to bearing weight, used to being alone. One night, as they sat near the fire, Clara asked, "Why don't you live in town?" Elias stared into the flames for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she met his eyes. "You don't think like them?" He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. I was raised by a mother twice my size who could fell a tree and make soup from its roots. You remind me of her." Clara's breath caught. No one had ever compared her to anything but shame. But Elias saw her, really saw her not as a burden, but as someone capable, valuable. When she stood beside him, helping haul logs or carry buckets of snow to melt, he didn't flinch at her size or slow his pace to mock her. He matched her rhythm, let her carry half the weight, respected her effort, and something inside her, long buried under rejections and stares, began to thaw. Days turned to weeks. The snow softened. Birds returned to the trees. They began to talk more. She told him about Chicago, about Everett Boone, about the laughter on the train platform. Elias listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, but never offering empty comfort. When she finished, she expected pity. Instead, he simply said, "That man's the fool, but you're not broken, Clara, you're forged." She didn't cry, not then, but she touched his hand a brief, calloused brush and whispered, "Thank you." From that moment, something shifted. They shared not just food and chores, but stories. Elias spoke of losing his brother in a logging accident, of growing up dirt poor with a mother who taught him the value of kindness, of long winters with no company but wolves and wind. Clara shared poems from her journal, told him of the girl she used to be, hopeful, naive, desperate for love, and the woman she was becoming, sturdy and steel-backed, carved by cold and fire. They didn't speak of love, not yet, but they shared warmth, built trust, laughed once or twice so hard the fire nearly went out. When Clara tripped one day, carrying a water bucket, Elias didn't rush to catch her. He offered a hand after she'd caught herself and said, "You've got your balance, just testing it." She smiled and realized no one had ever let her be strong before, only forced her to prove it or apologize for it. When spring finally broke through the frost and the ground turned soft underfoot, Elias didn't leave. He built her a new door, replaced the broken window with clear glass from an old cart. He started bringing gifts, nothing grand, just small tokens. A fresh trout from the river, a bar of soap that smelled like cedar, a book of folk tales he found in an abandoned cabin. And each time, Clara felt herself soften just a little more. One afternoon, as they sat on the steps watching the trees bloom, Elias said, "You built all this from nothing." Clara shrugged. "I built it because I had no choice." He shook his head. "No, you built it because you knew you deserved to live, even when no one else thought so." She turned to him, eyes brimming not with tears, but with realization. And before she could speak, Elias added, "And I see you, Clara, every part. And I ain't going anywhere unless you tell me to." She didn't. And he stayed. Spring in the pines arrived like a whispered promise of soft rains, cautious buds, and a sudden hush that blanketed the world after a winter of howling wind and bitter snow. With the storms behind them, Clara May Whitlock and Elias Thorne found themselves not just surviving together, but sharing something deeper, older, and stronger than the walls of the cabin. It began in the quiet moments. Elias whittling on the porch while Clara hung linens out to dry. Clara kneading dough while Elias chopped firewood within earshot. No grand confessions, no dramatic declarations. Just two people slowly stitching their hearts into the fabric of shared days. The cabin, once a symbol of Clara's retreat, had become a sanctuary for them both. Elias reinforced the roof with tar and flattened bark, built shelves for her jars, and added shutters with hand-carved latches. Clara, in turn, stitched new curtains from a bolt of gingham she'd bartered for in town. She filled jars with herbs and dried roots, labeled neatly with ink and care. What had once been 4 sagging walls was now a home not fancy, not flawless, but full of life. They had no proper table, so Elias made one. No clock, so Clara kept time by the sun and birdsong. And when night fell, they sat by the fire, not always talking, but always together. There were still days when the world crept in. Clara would wake with a weight in her chest, remembering how Everett's voice had sounded that day at the train station, or how the shopkeeper had flinched at her shadow. Elias had his silences too, times when his eyes darkened with old grief, and he wandered into the woods to be alone. But they gave each other space, never pushing, only welcoming when the other returned. It was a balance they never spoke about but honored like ritual. One morning, Clara caught Elias watching her as she braided her hair. She turned, arching an eyebrow. "What?" she asked. He looked sheepish, scratching his beard. "Just thinking how you carry everything like it belongs to you, like the sun rises on your terms." Clara laughed. "That's a new one. Most folks said I carried too much." Elias leaned back in his chair. "That's 'cause most folks are scared of anything that doesn't beg to be accepted." She paused, heart fluttering. "And you?" "Me?" He shrugged. "I think a woman like you doesn't need permission to be magnificent." They didn't kiss that day, or the next, but something passed between them, a warmth that lived in the way their fingers brushed when they handed tools, in the way Elias always poured her tea first, or how Clara made sure his socks dried by the fire every night without being asked. They knew what it was, even if they didn't name it. Then came the fox. It had gotten into the chicken coop Clara had built from scrap. She awoke to the shrieking of hens, rushed out barefoot, and saw feathers scattered like snowdrifts. She froze furious, heartbroken, and suddenly 12 again, back in Chicago where her cousins mocked her weight and told her she'd never be quick enough to stop anything. But Elias was already outside, axe in hand, shirt half buttoned. He didn't ask questions. Just looked her in the eye and said, "We'll rebuild it, stronger, higher, together." Together. That word lingered long after the coop was repaired, after the hens were calmed and fed, after Elias fixed the latch. Clara sat beside him exhausted and grateful, and realized she hadn't felt like too much in weeks. She felt like just enough, just right. Soon after, the town began to notice them. At first, it was subtle someone passing them on the road, nodding. Then the widow who'd once given Clara bread stopped by with extra yeast and a pie. A carpenter offered to trade nails for firewood. The same shopkeeper who had turned Clara away months ago now asked if she'd like to leave goods on consignment, their herbs, her balms, her winter preserves. Word had spread. The abandoned bride wasn't a cautionary tale any moreish was a success story with a man beside her who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. Elias was careful with the attention. He'd seen how fast towns could turn, how envy could bloom as fast as admiration. But Clara smiled through it all. She wasn't seeking approval anymore, she was choosing it, accepting praise with grace, dismissing lingering stares with a calm indifference that made even her critics blink. People called her strong now, resilient, capable, not pretty, not thin but powerful. Elias, meanwhile, made no apologies for loving a woman others had dismissed. "Folks need to see what love looks like," he said one night, sitting close enough that their knees touched. "And if it don't look like them, that's their business." The moment finally came one spring evening when Clara returned from town with a bolt of fabric and a small package wrapped in brown paper. She found Elias splitting kindling by the woodpile. She watched him for a minute before saying, "I've been thinking." He paused, wiped his brow, and turned. "About?" She walked over, placed the package in his hand. Inside was a leather-bound journal with his initials pressed into the cover. "About building something. Not just this cabin, but us." Elias blinked, slow and careful. "Us?" She nodded. "You and me. I know it ain't fancy, and I'm not the woman they put on posters, but I want to grow old here, with you, if you want that too." Elias didn't answer with words. He kissed her, soft, slow, sure. A kiss that wasn't about claiming or conquering but coming home. And just like that, the cabin became a promise. Not just of survival, but of love born not in the easy light of spring but in the bitter, freezing dark of winter. A love forged, not found, and one neither of them would ever again apologize for. Silverbrook had always been a town where gossip traveled faster than any telegram. The wind carried secrets between the saloon and the smithy, from the schoolhouse steps to the church pews. So when Clara May Whitlock, the woman once ridiculed on the train platform and dismissed as too large to marry, began to thrive in her little cabin beyond the tree line, tongues started wagging. At first it was disbelief wrapped in sarcasm. "You hear she's still out there?" the butcher's wife whispered one morning. "Living like a wild thing with that lumberjack hermit." The midwife raised an eyebrow. She hasn't come crawling back to town begging, has she? But as the months passed and winter turned to summer, the whispers changed tone. People began noticing small things. The herbs Clara gathered in neat linen pouches sold quietly through the general store actually worked. The balm she made for cracked hands cured the blacksmith's split knuckles in a week. The tincture she left with the widow Sims helped her sleep for the first time in months. "Stronger than any snake oil I've bought from a peddler," the sheriff grunted, patting his shoulder where an old wound had flared for years. Word spread. The girl from the train hadn't just survived, she was building something. And the man with her? Elias Thorne, the reclusive lumberjack folks once called a brute, was no fool. He spoke little, but paid his debts on time. He helped a farmer lift a wagon out of a ditch with his bare hands, brought chopped wood to the church when no one asked, protected Clara without speaking for her, stood beside her without overshadowing her. The two of them became a story, a strange one, a romantic one, and to some, an uncomfortable one. The first time Clara walked into town beside Elias, hand in hand, every eye turned. She wore a dress of deep forest green, sewn herself from rough cotton and mended at the hem. Her boots were worn but polished, her shoulders back, chin lifted, not defiant, just unashamed. Elias walked with her as if they were heading toward the altar, not the post office. It was a sight that made some townsfolk blink twice. A woman of her size, her strength, walking so confidently beside a man like that, it wasn't what they were used to. And that, more than anything, shook them. The preacher's wife approached her on the boardwalk. "Miss Whitlock," she said, tone caught between apology and admiration, "you're looking well." Clara smiled gently. "I am well," the woman hesitated. "It's just, I heard how Mr. Boone treated you. I'm sorry for that. We all are." Clara didn't gloat, didn't scold. She only nodded once and said, "I'm not," and walked away. Soon enough, the same townsfolk who once laughed at her were now asking questions. Could she spare more of her sleep tonic? Did she have any salve for burns? Was she willing to come speak to the Women's Guild about growing wild herbs? Clara didn't rush. She helped those who asked with respect, declined those who came with condescension. And always, Elias was nearby, not guarding her, but grounded beside her like the trees he chopped down daily. The two of them weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a way the town couldn't ignore. Children began to wave when they saw her. Men tipped their hats. The shopkeeper, the very same who once turned her away, offered her credit and apologized for the misunderstanding. Clara accepted the apology, but not the credit. She paid in full every time. That was the quiet way she commanded her dignity, not with vengeance, but with unwavering self-respect. The true shift came when the town hosted its summer fair, a tradition that had long been dominated by well-to-do families and those who fit a narrow mold of propriety. Elias convinced Clara to go. "You've earned it," he said. "You've built more than most men in this county." She wore a dress the color of riverstone, her hair pinned back with carved combs he'd made her himself. They arrived late, hoping to avoid the spectacle. But when they entered the fairground, all chatter ceased. For a moment, silence stretched so thin it nearly cracked. And then a little girl ran up to Clara with a jar of jam. "Miss Whitlock," she beamed, "I made this from your recipe." Clara knelt, took the jar gently and said, "That's the best gift I've had all year." And just like that, the town breathed again. Elias entered the lumberjack contest later that afternoon, not to prove anything, but because someone asked. He swung his axe with a quiet power, splitting logs with such precision that even his competitors applauded. Clara cheered from the sidelines, not loudly, but proudly. When he won, he gave the prize money to the orphanage. "Too many kids out there needing what I had," he said simply. That night, as lanterns lit the sky and fiddle music danced through the trees, Clara and Elias swayed together to a slow waltz. Others watched, some with wonder, some with envy, but none could deny what they were seeing. A love born from survival, shaped by hardship, and wrapped in an unspoken understanding that made all others feel small. But not everyone accepted their joy. Some grumbled that it was improper, unnatural, that a man like Elias deserved someone finer, and that Clara should know her place. Yet those voices were quieter now. outnumbered by those who saw the truth that real strength wasn't loud and real love didn't care about dress sizes or pedigree. Real love showed up with firewood, listened without judgment, and stayed even when the storms came. By the time autumn colored the trees gold and red, Clara had become a pillar of the community, not because she asked to be but because she had endured, grown, and returned stronger than ever. Silverbrook had watched her rise, and though some still whispered, most now whispered with awe. It was then, with everything seemingly in place, that the man who had once broken her in public came stumbling back into town. The day Everett Boone returned to Silverbrook was not marked by trumpets or triumph, but by the crunch of tired boots on dry gravel and the strained groan of a man too long lost in his own pride. No one expected him, no telegram, no warning. He simply arrived one crisp morning near the end of autumn, riding a horse too lean and wearing clothes that once spoke of prosperity, now faded, dust-stained, and hanging loose on a thinner frame. Gone was the cocky man in the stiff collar and polished boots who had stood proudly on the train platform, sizing up a woman and finding her unworthy. In his place stood a man weathered not just by miles, but by the choices that had unraveled him thread by thread. The first to see him was the stable hand, now 15, who remembered Everett's laugh that day on the platform. He said nothing, just took the reins with a stiff nod and watched the stranger look around town like a ghost revisiting the scene of his own funeral. Everett stepped into the general store and was greeted not with welcome, but with wary silence. The shopkeeper glanced up, blinked, and then went back to counting sugar sacks. "Boone," he muttered, not looking up again. Everett cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Clara May Whitlock." That made the shopkeeper pause. He looked him in the eye for the first time and said, "You'd best be looking elsewhere." But Everett didn't leave. He asked questions, tried to trade stories for information, told half-truths about being misled, not in his right mind, pressured by expectations. No one cared. His name had long since lost its luster. Silverbrook wasn't the same town he'd left. The people he once thought would nod along with him now turned away. Even the preacher, once a family friend, refused to shake his hand. "You made your bed," he said, "and then you set it on fire." Word of Everett's return spread quickly, and inevitably it reached the cabin in the pines. Clara was harvesting the last of her herbs for the season when Elias rode up, dismounted, and tied his horse with more tension than usual. "He's back," he said simply. She didn't ask who. She didn't have to. She stood quietly, fingers brushing over the rim of her harvest basket, her breath a calm, even rhythm. "What does he want?" she asked. Elias's jaw tightened. "He's asking for you," Clara nodded once. "Then he can come." And he did. The next day, Everett climbed the hill to the cabin, slower than he'd ever walked before. The trail, once too wild for his polished boots, now greeted him with every crunch of dry leaves like a warning drumbeat. The cabin came into view strong, mended, alive with smoke curling from the chimney. Clara was on the porch, seated on a hand-carved bench, her hands resting on her lap. She wore no fancy dress, no makeup, no armor but the strength she had earned. Elias stood nearby, leaning against a beam with arms crossed and eyes that could cut down trees without moving. Everett stopped 10 paces away. "Clara," he said. She looked at him not cruelly, not even coldly, just clearly. "You look well," he said awkwardly. "I am," she answered. He shifted, twisting his hat in his hands. "I came to say I was wrong, about everything, that day at the station." Clara raised a hand, not harsh, just enough. "You don't need to explain," she said. "I was there." He swallowed hard. "I thought I needed something different, but I've learned. Since then, you were more than I deserved." Clara stood slowly, stepping down to meet him level. "Everett," she said softly, "I didn't need you to deserve me. I needed you to respect me, and you couldn't do that." His shoulders sagged. "I've changed." "Maybe," she said, "but I haven't stayed still, waiting to see. I came to ask, maybe we could start over." Elias straightened at that, jaw flexing, but Clara placed a calming hand on his arm, just a touch, light as breath. "Start over?" she repeated, almost tasting the words. "Everett, I started over the moment you turned your back, and it was the best decision of my life." Silence fell between them. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. The wind moved the trees like sighs. "I'm happy," she said. "I have a home. I have love. I have peace. You gave me the gift of walking away, and I won't dishonor that gift by inviting you back into a life you never earned." He looked at her for a long time, the reality sinking in not with rage, but with quiet, devastating clarity. He turned, nodding once, and walked down the trail the same way he came, alone. Elias stepped beside her and said nothing. Clara leaned into his shoulder and whispered, "It's done now." And it was. No revenge, no drama, just closure, sharp, final, and free. The day Clara May Whitlock married Elias Thorne dawned with the kind of stillness that only the pines could hold, a hush that blanketed the earth like reverence, as if even nature knew something sacred was about to unfold. There were no bells, no gilded carriages, no crowds pressed together in pews, whispering about who wore what. There was only the forest, breathing softly around them, the breeze weaving between the trees like a gentle song, and the slow, sure rhythm of a love that had weathered storms and grown roots deeper than most hearts ever dared to plant. They chose the clearing just beyond the cabin, where the moss grew thick beneath their boots, and the sunlight slanted through the evergreens in golden columns. Clara wore a dress she made, herself soft ivory linen, embroidered with pine needles and forget-me-nots along the hem. Her hair, usually tied in a no-nonsense braid, flowed freely down her back, touched with wildflowers she'd gathered from the riverbank that morning. She had never felt more herself, no corsets, no paint, no attempt to hide the body the world had once scorned. Elias wore a shirt of crisp white and a vest of dark green wool, stitched by Clara's own hands, and a carved wooden pin at his collar shaped like a tiny axanther quiet joke. He'd shaved, combed his thick hair, and looked at her like she was both sunrise and home. The guests came not from far cities or distant relatives, but from the lives they had touched. Widow Sims brought bread and a shawl she'd knitted for the occasion. The stable hand who'd once helped Clara find the old cabin brought a bouquet of wildflowers and cried quietly when she walked down the path. The preacher who had refused to bless Everett Boone years ago now stood under a hand-built archway of pine and birch, smiling as he waited with a small leather-bound Bible in hand. Clara walked toward Elias not with trembling nerves but with steady steps and eyes locked on his, because this was not a leap of faith. This was a step toward a life already being lived, a love already tested. When she reached him, he took both her hands and whispered, "You look like every good thing I ever hoped for." And she answered, "You made space for me when the world said I took up too much." The preacher cleared his throat and began to speak, but the words barely mattered. What mattered was the silence between the vows, the shared history not etched into paper, but into scars and soil. They spoke their promises not from tradition, but from memory. Elias vowed to never shrink her, to never flinch at her power, to hold space for her fire and her stillness. Clara promised to build with him not just shelter, but sanctuary, to meet him in silence and in storms, and to never apologize for her presence again. There were no objections, no gasps, no drama. Only the wind sighing through the branches like applause, and the sound of Elias whispering, "My heart is yours, woman of strength." They kissed, not as strangers fused by ceremony, but as soulmates tempered by time. And when they turned to face the small crowd, hands clasped tightly, the people rose not in thunderous cheer, but in warm, knowing smiles, the kind reserved for things rightfully restored. The celebration that followed was simple and perfect. Tables were laid with patchwork cloths and filled with food brought by the guests: roasted venison, fresh bread, spiced cider, and preserves from Clara's pantry. Elias had built a small platform for dancing, and a trio of fiddle players struck up slow, swinging tunes. Clara danced with the widow, then the stable boy, then Elias, who picked her up once mid-spin and twirled her like she weighed no more than a breath. Her laughter rang out across the clearing, high and fearless. As night fell and the lanterns were lit, Clara stepped away for a moment, looking out over the pines. The cabin behind her glowed like a hearth at the end of a long journey. She felt the past stirring behind Hearth train station, the cold nights alone, the hollow ache of rejection. But it didn't hurt anymore. It simply existed, like the roots of a tree buried deep beneath her feet, a reminder, not a wound. Elias came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You all right?" he murmured into her hair. She nodded. "I'm more than all right." He kissed her shoulder. "You're mine now." She smiled, resting her head against his chest. "No," she whispered, "I'm still mine. But I choose you, every day." And he understood, because that was the kind of love they had grown together, not possession, but partnership, not rescue, but recognition. Two whole people, broken in places but not defeated, leaning on one another without leaning too hard. That night, as they lay beneath their handmade quilt in the cabin they'd rebuilt with their own hands, Clara whispered into the dark, "I never thought I'd be this happy." Elias squeezed her hand and replied, "That's 'cause they never let you believe you could be, but you were always meant for this." She turned to him, her eyes gleaming with tears and joy. "No more hiding. No more shame," he agreed. "Just us." And so they slept, not in the fairy tale silence of a perfect ending, but in the sturdy stillness of something real, something earned. The wind curled around the cabin, the trees standing tall in witness, and the stars blinked above like the blessings of ancestors finally at peace. They were not the couple anyone had expected, but they were the couple that proved love doesn't follow rules. It grows wild, like pine through rock, unstoppable and true.